Alright guys, so I'm going to continue to make my videos from this video suggestions tab on Discord, just showing y'all what today's video is. And right here, it's from Club Dub. This one actually got a couple thumbs up, so we are going to go through and do this one. I know a lot of people have been wanting it, and let's just get into the video.
That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
All right, so we are going to do this player by player, and then after I discuss each prospect, I'm going to dive into their landing spots, because for these rookie running backs, I truly believe that it's best to just profile them, try to get a feel for who they are as a running back, and then really dive deeper into their landing spots and try to realize how they are going to be utilized in both their rookie season and beyond. So first, let's start off with Cam Akers, who is 5'10", 217 pounds. This is the first thing I always like to look at for these running backs. I want to see what their size is. I want to see if they are going to be able to be a 3-down running back, if they're going to be able to hold up to 20 to 25 touches a game. And clearly, Cam Akers, with his 71st percentile BMI, is no Jonathan Taylor, but at the same time, he is a running back that is definitely going to be able to hold up throughout the entire season with a full workload. So you love to see that. And the second thing you love to see is Cam Akers' age. He's actually 20.9 years old, so he's not even 21 years old yet. Obviously, he will be by the time the season starts, but this is something that's extremely important, because if you listen to Scott at all, who runs the Dynasty and Chill podcast, I believe that he is probably the best Dynasty podcaster there is, and he actually went out and did a study based on these rookie prospects and their ages and how that affects their career coming into the NFL. And long story short, you want your running backs coming into the NFL at a young age. You want them to be early 21 years old coming into the NFL. You don't want to see a Keyshawn Vaughn coming in at 23 years old. And we do get to see Cam Akers come in. He's going to be 21 when the season starts, and that's always a great box to check. But now let's look at the athleticism. And I know I say with my wide receiver videos that I don't necessarily care too much about wide receiver athleticism. I would rather see production, and I'd rather see what they did in college. But for the running backs, it's almost the opposite. Yes, production matters to an extent to see how they were used, but at the same time, I'm really just looking for traits at the running back position. I want them to have the size, and I want them to have the athleticism along with the pass catching ability to really be a 3-down running back at the NFL level. I don't necessarily care too much about their production, but it does matter. And Cam Akers is athletic. He ran a 4.47 40-yard dash at the NFL Combine, and this goes to a 89 percentile speed score, which is from playerprofiler.com. A lot of things wrong with that website, but the one thing they do well is I love their speed score metric, which converts their 40-yard dash time to a size-adjusted speed score, and I love looking at this for the running back position. Even though if you do look at his SPARQ score, it's actually only in the 63rd percentile, but SPARQ score actually takes into account bench press way more than they should, so SPARQ score for running backs isn't too important, even though it will give you a window into their athleticism. But let's look at Cam Akers' production in college, and what I want everyone to keep in mind is that Cam Akers was running behind one of the worst offensive lines in college football. I know it's crazy to say. You would think that Florida State would be a premier program with a premier offensive line, but that's the exact opposite of what they were throughout Cam Akers' career at Florida State. But in 2017, he comes in. He's actually a 5-star recruit, one of the highest pedigree players in the entire class coming out of high school, and he lands at Florida State, and he actually averages 15 rushes a game, almost 80 rushing yards, and 1.23 receptions a game. I know a lot of people love to look at yards per carry, but in college, I don't think it's very predictable looking at yards per carry from transitioning to college to the NFL, because we all know by now, it's 2020. I think it's common knowledge that the running back position is easily the most affected position by the situation that they were running behind. So I'm really looking at their overall profile instead of their efficiency at the college level. But in 2018, he actually saw a dip in production in every single category except receptions, and that's the one thing I like to look at. I like to see that Cam Akers, who was more of a wildcat quarterback coming out of high school, was able to take another step forward in terms of catching the ball, especially considering that we need him to be able to do that at the NFL level to be productive. But in 2019, going into the season, Cam Akers was off a lot of Dynasty players' radars, even though he came out with such a great prospect profile coming out of high school and a ton of people were excited about him. But after disappointing in his first 2 seasons, he comes in 2019, rushes over 20 times a game, over 100 yards a game, and almost catches 3 receptions a game. So he proves that even in a horrible situation, he is able to handle a full workload and is able to be productive with what he gets. But now let's try to analyze Cam Akers' situation in 2020 with the Los Angeles Rams. So the Rams O-line actually was ranked the 31st O-line after the 2019 season by PFF. So the only team that had a better offensive line than the Los Angeles Rams were the Miami Dolphins, who we know really had no assets other than draft picks and were able to go out there and invest in their offensive line throughout the offseason. But we know the Rams are completely out of assets from some bad trades and from some bad contracts. So this offseason, they went from having the 31st ranked offensive line to actually not being able to improve it at all. So I think this is a team we can project to maybe have the league's worst offensive line in 2020, which is something that Cam Akers had dealt with his entire collegiate career. The one bright spot that we can look at for this Los Angeles Rams team, though, is after their bye week in 2019, they switched to playing a lot more 12 personnel with 2 tight ends on the field, and this actually increased their offensive efficiency, especially with running the ball. So hopefully having more tight ends on the field in 2020 will actually help improve the Los Angeles Rams run blocking ability, and this will help create space for Cam Akers, but it's not something that you should be optimistic about. The rushing situation in LA is definitely looking doubtful. But let's get into J.K. Dobbins, and we'll actually talk about some projections that I have at the end of the video, but let's talk about J.K. Dobbins' prospect profile first. And first off, we always have to look at the size of these running backs, and J.K. Dobbins is 5'10", 209 pounds, which puts him in the 46th percentile for BMI. And I know most people haven't really been talking about this. I don't think I've actually heard a single person talking about it, but I'm actually concerned that this was a lot of water weight as well. I know people are expecting J.K. Dobbins to weigh more than this going into the NFL Combine, but we have to actually look out for these players who don't test. If they do have size concerns, that's the time where they're able to put on water weight. I know everyone always mentions that with the NFL Combine, but I think it's kind of overblown because if you're going to go out there and try to run a 40-yard dash, you don't want to be really water weight heavy, except if you're not testing at all, which J.K. Dobbins did not do with his ankle injury this offseason. So maybe J.K. Dobbins was actually able to put on an additional 5 to 6 pounds. And if he was coming in at 5'10", 203, 204 pounds, that would be extremely concerning, whereas 5'10", 209 pounds is just slightly concerning. But we're going to skip past that. Let's look at his age, athleticism, and where the Baltimore Ravens decided to take him at the NFL draft. And he's 21 years old, something that we talked about with Cam Akers, which is a great sign. He was selected with the 23rd pick in the 2nd round of the NFL draft, and he did not test this offseason at the NFL Combine or at a pro day due to his injury. But if we look at his testing coming out of high school, he actually scored the highest SPARQ score at the Nike Opening, where Cam Akers was there as well, and Cam Akers finished 3rd in that testing. So J.K. Dobbins, we know he's extremely athletic. If he was extremely athletic coming out of high school, there's no way that the Ohio State strength and conditioning staff did not only help him, but make him one of the most athletic running backs in the class. Now, one other thing that I've actually heard a couple other Dynasty podcasters talking about, and I thought it was a great comparison, and I can't believe I didn't think about it myself, but we know one concern with J.K. Dobbins' 2019 production was a lot of people said, hey, look, it's Justin Fields. Justin Fields can run the ball, and he's opening up space for J.K. Dobbins with their read options. Well, you know what NFL team is the best NFL team at read options? The Baltimore Ravens. So that's one more bonus for the J.K. Dobbins profile, but let's get into what he did in college. And in 2017, he averaged almost 14 rushes a game, 100 yards a game, and about 1.5 receptions a game. So it's nothing fantastic. He wasn't able to handle a complete workload, but we see the efficiency is completely off the charts, which you expect it to be at a program like Ohio State. Now we go to 2018. He bumps up his rushing attempts and he bumps up his receptions, which we love to see. And he averages almost 17 rushes, 75 yards, and almost 2 receptions a game. And like I said earlier, I know the efficiency is down a little bit, but I'm not too concerned about efficiency at the running back position in college due to it being so heavily impacted by situation. Now in 2019, we see J.K. Dobbins actually put up over 21 rush attempts a game, almost 150 yards a game, and 1.64 receptions a game. So we see his reception totals go down, but that is due to Justin Fields not necessarily looking to check the ball down as much because he has the rushing ability himself. And we know with rushing quarterbacks, they don't look to dump the ball off as much as stationary quarterbacks. So if we look at the two overall prospect profiles, they are very similar, and I can't really go out there and put one guy significantly ahead of the other just because they both have their strengths and weaknesses. But let's dive into their situations in 2020 and try to determine where their dynasty value will be a year from now. So first, let's look at Cam Akers and the Los Angeles Rams. And in 2019, the Los Angeles Rams actually had 401 rushing attempts, almost 1,500 rushing yards, and about a .05 TD rate. And if we look at how their running backs caught the ball, they had 35 receptions and 250 yards. Obviously, we're not going to give all this to Cam Akers. That would just be ridiculous. And I know most people would say, oh, give Cam Akers 60, 70% of that. But that's not really how math works when you look at season-long projections. I think it's a lot easier to give him 45% of that. I think that's a fair estimate. Obviously, he's going to be getting less than that early on in the season, but maybe he can be getting more than that later on in the season. So I think that's a good median projection for us to give him. Now, if you give Cam Akers 45% of that 2019 production, he ends up with 180 rushing attempts, almost 700 rushing yards, about 15 receptions, and almost 115 receiving yards. I'm not going to go out there and project rushing touchdowns or receiving touchdowns just because they are so volatile and it's so hard to predict from year to year what the touchdown market share will be for any given player on a team. And I'm not going to be out here and pretending like I can do that with confidence. So we're going to ignore that for now. But let's look at J.K. Dobbins and what the Ravens did in 2019. So in 2019, the Baltimore Ravens had almost 600 rushing attempts, almost 330 yards, 5.5 yards per carry, and 21 touchdowns. And now I know y'all are all yelling at the computer, Mason, Lamar Jackson accounted for a lot of that. You have to take Lamar Jackson out. And yes, I did. So let's take Lamar Jackson out and let's look at how this looks with just the running backs. So with just the running backs, we see 420 rushing attempts, over 2,000 rushing yards, 14 touchdowns, 50 receptions, and 350 receiving yards. Now I know this is about the same volume that we saw in Los Angeles, but this is the point. We can clearly identify how much better of a situation Baltimore is than Los Angeles. And if we look at the PFF grades for rushing offensive lines, we see that the Baltimore Ravens were the second best offensive line after the 2019 season. And yes, they have lost some pieces, but they have also replaced some pieces with early round draft picks in the NFL draft. So I think this is an easy team to predict to have a great offensive line in 2020. And yes, Mark Ingram is still there, Gus Edwards is there, and Justice Hill is there. But I think J.K. Dobbins immediately slides into that RB2 role. And I think by the end of the season, J.K. Dobbins is actually the running back one in Baltimore. But let's be conservative and give him 35% of these teams' rushing production. So if he has 35% of what we saw the Baltimore Ravens with in 2019, he averages about 150 rushing attempts, 730 rushing yards, 18 receptions, and 122 yards. So yes, he will have significantly less rushing attempts than Cam Akers, but I think we can project his efficiency to be a lot higher than Cam Akers and actually outweigh the loss in attempts with more rushing yards and score more fantasy points. So if we're looking at these two running backs and we believe that J.K. Dobbins will outscore Cam Akers in 2020, and not only that, Mark Ingram will be out of the picture in 2021, I think J.K. Dobbins is the clear choice over Cam Akers, and I'm not really even thinking about it. And this is coming from someone who has drafted Cam Akers a lot more than J.K. Dobbins in rookie drafts, just because of the part of the round I have been picking lately. But thanks, guys. I really hope you all enjoyed the video. Really hope you all got something from it. As always, if you did, make sure you go subscribe and hit the bell next to it. That way you know when the next video is uploaded. Thanks, guys.